How do we manage waste across the island? Who's responsible for recycling, and why do some local authorities pay substantially more for their regional recycling centres than others? Is the current rate system fair, and if not, why has rates reform never been tackled? And while we're discussing reform, why do we have such a disparate range of local authorities, from very large to tiny? Local democracy reporter Emma Draper joins me in the studio to ponder these questions.
There is, surprisingly so much to cover with local authorities. It's quite strange, really.
And, well, let's ensure that we do at least cover some of the detail by starting. What better way to start than waste? Who is responsible for waste in the Isle of Man in terms of your 2 years studying the topic?
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, waste as in bins and recycling. Yeah, okay. So, well, who's in charge I feel like is quite, well, it sounds quite simple, but it's actually quite, there's quite a maze, I think, of information, because obviously a lot of people assume that, we'll start with the CA site and we'll work our way down. So I think a lot of people assume that the CA site, where a lot of people go to drop their rubbish off, is run by the government, but it's not. It's the local authorities, and we've obviously had a lot of drama. Yeah, I'm going to go for drama with the civic community sites recently, especially the one in the north, with bride commissioners refusing to pay their share of it. There's a lot of reasons as to why, and there's a lot of conflicting points of view, but I think it's fair to say that they have stopped paying, and their residents are no longer allowed to use the CA site. And
I suppose that in itself is worth consideration. How can they stop paying? I mean, how does that work?
So from what I've from the people I've spoken to, and from what I've worked out, essentially the Northern Civic Community Site is run in a slightly different way to the other one. So they just have a joint committee, and they were unhappy with the way it was run. So the civic community sites are run based on the rateable value of the area. So when you pay your rates, that's basically what it's ran on. And they obviously have a large amount of not retail, that's industrial rates coming in, because they've got a big the quarry.
Yeah, there's
the quarry.
The quarry and the former. Well, I don't know. Is it a former, or is it still being used? The tip, the landfill site down there.
Yes, yeah.
And in terms of brides' rates, that makes a big difference, doesn't it? I mean, something like half the rates are commercial rates.
Yeah, so they have the lowest rate on the island, and a lot of that is, and I'm sure they would admit it as well, is supplemented by the quarry. But then again, they are then, because of how the civic community sites works, they are then sort of in their eyes put at a disadvantage, because it means that a lot of their residents and their rates are paying a larger chunk into the CA site when they only have fewer residents. But then again, there's arguments for, well, then everybody should pay their own fair share and everybody should pay the same amount. But then it's how do you work that out? So it's quite complicated. But then,
and of course that's right. in a way, we're getting on to rates, which we do need to tackle at some point, because rates is generally deemed to be an unfair tax, but it's the fairest variety of local tax so far, anyway, that we've managed to come up with in I don't know, 40, 50, maybe even 60 years of trying.
Yeah, and I think as well, a lot of people see when, I think it was January, February time when they all came out, and I did a big story about all of them. And I think a lot of people look at their areas and they're like, well, why am I paying more than them? Or why has theirs gone up so much and mine's gone up even more? Or why has theirs stayed the same and mine's gone up by huge amounts? Or I'm paying a lot less than, my friend who lives in Sulby. And it's one of those things where there's so many discrepancies, and there's so many factors that go into it. And the best case is Brad commissioners who had to jump up their rates by about 35%, I think 36%, something like that, because of the roundhouse development and all the things that have been going on with that one. And it's such a and then you've obviously got other local authorities who are benefited, like bride commissioners and also like Maloo commissioners, who have big industrial estates in their areas where they can keep the rates slightly lower. So again, it's sort of like a balance of how do you make sure that people are paying for the local authority services without disadvantaging people and making it look unfair to people who live in other areas. And I'm glad I'm not trying to solve that problem.
So let's get back to waste and see can we fathom this, because it is complicated. And I'm saying this as someone who was formerly the minister responsible for developing waste policy, as well as now being the clerk for a local authority that has to deal with another element of waste. And it's not obvious and it's not clear necessarily who does which bit. Even for someone like me who's got a fair understanding of it, there are plenty of grey areas on all this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, so a lot of people will obviously have their, either if you live in Douglas, so I think some rural areas will have a bi-weekly bin collection and others will be weekly. I think a lot of people just assume, oh, that's probably the government, but it's not. It's the local authorities that organise it. And some local authorities share the duties. So I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong because you'll probably know more, but I think Onchan and Port St Mary work together. I don't know, you might know a bit more.
I'm not sure. Was it Onchan and Port St Mary or possibly I know Douglas empties bins or has emptied bins for other local authorities. I also know that Port Erin and Maloo work together on waste collection. And of course in the north we've got the Northern Parishes Refuse Board, which includes many of the parishes in the north. Basically they contribute to this collection board, and a certain proportion of their rates income is paid directly to the board, and then the board deals with all of the waste collection.
Yeah, and I think that's actually quite a good idea to share the burden of waste collection, because again, like it's such a massive cost. It's one of the highest costs that a lot of local authorities have is bin collections and recycling collections. And we've seen a lot recently of like outsourcing to local companies and like local businesses to that, which is great. Like it's a great resource to have. But again, it's adding another layer to what people are paying for and what residents are paying for, and if they even know what they're paying for. But yeah, and then obviously then I think a lot of people assume a lot of that all goes to the incinerator, which is a big myth I think that a lot of people still believe in, but some of it obviously does and some of it doesn't. I think some of it still gets sent off.
Yeah, so effectively, I mean, what I understand of it anyway, what is absolutely clear is local authorities have a responsibility in law to collect waste, so they have to collect waste. Where the grey areas come in is recycling collecting waste, because effectively the recyclists aren't waste because they are then used for another purpose. They're recycled and repurposed, I suppose. So is that waste collection? It certainly reduces the amount of waste that ends up going to the incinerator or the energy from waste plant, as we probably still should call it. But is recycling actually a responsibility of local authorities or not? And that's not absolutely clear, certainly in terms of how the legislation is situated. What is clear is the department, which is for this purpose the Department of Infrastructure. The Department of Infrastructure is responsible for setting national policy. So the department can make clear who is responsible for things like recycling. It can make clear what things should be recycled. It can make clear what things should be put in a bin. And of course, what goes in a bin is pretty obvious when you bear in mind that the bin that is collected by the bin wagon, that does go directly to the incinerator, to the energy from waste plant. So it is quite clear that if you put things like bricks or bottles or tins in your bin, they're not going to produce much energy, are they? In fact, they're going to clog up the system, and ultimately they result in a cost, because the bottom ash from the incinerator it has to be disposed of, and it costs money to dispose of it. So yeah. And the other element to all this then is education. Who's responsible for education? And what we're not talking about here is having getting all the the waste producers on the island man, all the adults, every household has to go back to school to learn about waste. But basic stuff like education programs, which Douglas Borough Council, for example, do. Most of the rest of the local authorities don't actually have much by way of education, and that could be as simple as a sticker on your bin saying the bin will be very happy if you put this in, but it'll be less pleased if you put something else in. So all that stuff remains in that kind of grey area. Who's responsible for recycling? Not absolutely clear. Possibly the Department of Infrastructure. And then, of course, DEFRA comes in on this as well, because DEFRA has certain responsibilities in relation to the environment. And how does all that work? And how does this all tie in with the Climate Change Act? And, because surely to goodness we shouldn't be burning our waste. And then, of course, you get back to the reduce, reuse, recycle message, which used to be promoted across the whole of the island. But unfortunately, the budget for promoting that message was cut, so it's less prevalent now. But effectively, what it says, the basic premise is, we shouldn't be producing any waste. Everything that we no longer need, there should be some mechanism to either recycle it or reuse it. But best of all is try and reduce the amount that you create in the first place.
Yeah, and I think on your point about the Department of Infrastructure, I'm led to believe that there's a report that's being produced, or they are in the process of doing a report about waste management. I think that was brought up at council meeting, actually, a Douglas council meeting, about waste management strategy. I don't know if you have any more information on it, but as far as I'm aware, I feel like that might be included in it. But again, we'll just have to wait till it drops and see what happens.
Yeah, and again, from a media perspective, you can understand why the department might not want to tell you in every detail every single policy that's working up. But speaking with my clerk to Arbury and Russian Parish Commissioner's hat on, as far as I'm aware, we've not been consulted on what that strategy might look like, and yet our ratepayers will be funding a fair bit of it in relation to certainly collection of waste, and possibly also recycling. So it's interesting that these policies could or strategies could be developed without consultation. Maybe consultation is just around the corner. Maybe.
Well, we'll never know until it happens, I guess. But I can't for the life of me remember what it said, but yeah, hopefully there's some consultation, because it would make sense if there was, because if the local authority is in charge of waste management and you want to try and transform it or make it better and improve it, then why not go to the people who organise it on behalf of the majority of the residents on the Isle of Man?
And of course, the bit that I missed out in my summary was the civic amenity sites, which seem like the strangest of names to describe what is effectively a recycling centre. That's primarily what it's about. I mean, there is obviously a place to dump what could be classed as burnable rubbish, but on the whole, its main purpose is to recycle stuff and allow for reuse. And most of these are funded, directly via the ratepayers. But of course, as we've discovered in the situation in Bride, if the constitution of the board that manages the site hasn't been formally constituted or properly made, then you have the ability as a Bride commissioner to say, actually, no, we're not going to do that. And then we get on to rates, because rates... it's a very, very interesting tax. Effectively, it's a tax on the value of, or the rental value of your property, based on what that rental value might have been back in the 1970s, which seems a little outdated.
Yeah, I mean, given the fact that, I wasn't born in the 1970s, or nowhere close to being born in the 1970s, it's very weird. It's such a bizarre system to have, but if that's the best they can come up with, then I guess it's the best that they can come up with. But It's it's definitely a I don't know where they go about reforming it, because I know that's been on the topic quite a lot recently, especially with there's been an inquiry in the north where it came up a few times about rates and rate reform and the disparity between what residents in Ramsey pay and what people in Lozère and people in Macclesfield and people in the surrounding areas pay. And I think that it has come to the forefront a little bit, but I guess we'll have to see what happens in the election cycle, and if any of our if any MH want to be MHKs put their head up and go, I want rate reform. It'd be interesting to see, I think.
Yeah, very interesting, because if you look at the whole way in which the Isle of Man is taxed, there are certain things that we have little control over. So VAT, for example, it's a big income for the Isle of Man government, but it's set by the UK. We have a reciprocal arrangement, but basically the UK sets the rules, and we follow, and we get a take out of a shared pot for VAT. So that's one thing we can't really change, but it's a valuable income source. We also have income tax and all the various duties as well that are set by the UK. Income tax we could have more control over, but again, the competitive nature of the Isle of Man, in terms of most of the businesses we do, income tax is seen as a really important thing that businesses look at to see whether they want to have their business in the Isle of Man or not. And then we have local taxation, in our case rates, which is incredibly low compared with most of the countries that surround us. I mean, I'm not saying that it is necessarily a small bill that comes through, particularly if you're a resident of one of the towns. It's a significant amount of money, but it's still remarkably low compared with what you would pay if you were in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland.
Absolutely, no, I agree, and I think it's quite interesting. I'm sure a lot of people over here may have family in the UK, and I don't know if it's ever discussed, but I think from speaking to some local democracy reporters across, and sometimes they have council tax, which is a bit of a different system, but it's the same sort of concept. And some of our rates, and some people might pay £200 a year on their rates bill, and some people in the UK pay £2,000 a month. They are vastly, vastly different, and the mind boggles. It really does, because I'm like, we have some people paying maybe £200 a year if you live somewhere with low rates, and then some people in the UK literally maybe paying even upwards like £1,500 a month, depending on if you maybe live in a big town or somewhere where they like a rural place. But it's crazy, the difference. It's absolutely crazy.
And of course, one of the reasons often cited for not transferring services responsibility for service delivery to local authorities, there's two reasons given. One is that we need to reform the structure, because until the structure is reformed, how can you possibly expect these local authorities to deliver the services? And then the other one, of course, is, rates is unfair, and actually adding more to the rates burden is just not a thing we should do until we've reformed the rating system. So in essence, those reasons tend to be used as the excuse for things just carrying on the same way as they always have.
Yeah, it's a bit of a circle, isn't it? Because a lot of people are like, oh, we need less local authorities, but we won't be able to fix that until we fix the rates. And you kind of just go in a big circle all the time. And yeah, I mean, obviously there's a few MHKs currently who have made a claim for having I think it's 5 plus 1, I think they are in favour of.
Certainly 4 plus 1.
4 plus 1, yes. 4 plus 1, sorry about that. Yeah, 4 plus 1 that they're in favour of. And, I hear a lot of arguments from local authorities. Sometimes it pops up on the agenda and they say, well, we're here to give local people a voice, and you can't have local people have a voice. You can't have that if you have one massive authority for all of the south and all of the north. That's not how communities get represented. And you can completely see where they're coming from. And I think one of the things that if it does happen, and if we do end up with a 4 plus 1 system is you'd have to manage a lot of staff, you'd have to manage a lot of the services that local authorities offer, and you may end up with almost like a second level of government rather than just here's your local commissioners and this is what they do. You may end up with a separate separate North government, separate South government, separate West government. I mean, obviously that might not happen and it might be completely fine, but there are so many things to consider when you look at changing the structure of local government, because I mean, I'm not entirely sure how long the system we've had going on for now, but it does feel bizarrely like I've reported on a few things where I've been like, oh, is this the start? I mean, Patrick Commissioners had 3 people resign in one go and they were left with, I think, two people left on the board. And I was like, oh my gosh, what is going to happen here? And you've got Bride pulling out the CA site and you're like, is this the start of something? But again, it never happens because the system functions. Like, it's probably not the most effective, and I'm sure it is absolutely not the most effective, but it functions in a way that maybe it shouldn't do, but it does, it works. So you would have to find maybe a more efficient version of what is already in place to make it work better, I think.
And of course that then opens up some of the other questions. Are local authorities as efficient as they should be? And would collaboration make them more efficient? Well, you could kind of see a case where waste collection, that would seem to make some sense if one authority across the whole of the west of the island was responsible for waste collection, then you would imagine there would be economies of scale. And then you also have to look at services and which services are delivered. All local authorities deliver the services that they are statutorily required to do. So then the rural authorities, such as the one that I'm clerk for, get accused by the town authorities of not delivering the same amount of services, and it's not fair on their ratepayers. That could easily be solved. It could be solved in October if the infrastructure minister was so minded, by going to Tynwald with an order saying from this point on all local authorities shall be responsible for delivering all these services. The argument against that has always been, well, yes, but the structure's not in place to allow them to deliver these things. And yet, most of the smaller local authorities have contracts with professional companies to deliver most of the services. This is effectively what Chris Robertshaw was banging on about for so many years when he was in the House of Keys, about smaller, smarter government. And local authorities are kind of doing that. The smaller ones, they commission services, they check to make sure the services have been delivered, and they pay the bills at the end of the month. They don't have large staff and all the associated cost that goes with that.
Yeah, and I think as well, like if a lot, obviously, I think we spoke about it in last week's episode about just the sheer size of some local authorities, and yeah, sometimes the smaller ones are more efficient because there's only one member of staff working, but then obviously you've got one member of staff working and it's quite difficult, but to manage quite a lot of things on one go. But I think also on your point about working together and merging, obviously your local authority merged, and obviously Garth commissioners were 3 separate and they all merged, and I think sometimes there is like some success in that. Obviously, like it's quite efficient now for your local authority to function and serve the people that it is supposed to serve, and I think it helps when local authorities work together, because you see it quite often with the waste management and the in the bin collections and stuff like that. Like, it works, and the joint committees generally for a lot of the like the swimming pools, the joint committees there, I mean, as far as I'm aware, they have no issues, but again, there might not be, I don't know, but they function and when they work together to make it, I mean, it just makes it more efficient, doesn't it? So maybe they need more of that in the future.
And actually, mentioning swimming pools, and sadly we don't have time to go into that because we're coming almost at the end of the programme. But yes, swimming pools. There's a northern board, a western board, and an east and a southern board.
Yeah.
There's no eastern board.
No.
The 3 regions pay for their swimming pool, but the east primarily because Douglas Borough Council gave the land to central government. The East effectively gets away without paying anything towards its swimming pool. Now, it's described as a national pool, but it's a pretty thin excuse for the people living in Braddon, Onken, and I think it extends into Garth, the eastern area. So yeah, a thin excuse. I think that nothing is paid by the people in the East for the regional pools, and then there's the often cited but never delivered suggestion that maybe we need an area recreation rate which would cover swimming pools and other things, but it hasn't as yet been delivered. Yeah, well, I think we've got a bit more detail in on this week's programme, which is great, and well, maybe we'll have you back at some point in the future to talk more about the role.
Yeah, and I mean, we do have local authority elections in not this time next year. They're probably in less than a year now, isn't it, I think?
Absolutely.
So it might be all changed. You never know.
That was local democracy reporter Emma Draper. So what do you think? Is it okay to continue to muddle through with our somewhat archaic system of local government? Is the rating system fit for purpose? And if not, what would you replace it with? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, though, I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Mayo. Thanks for listening.